Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Hope you had a fantastic weekend. Boy, I tell you, I did, with a little caveat, but got to go to Arkansas and visit my daughter, my son-in-law, and my grandkids. Had a fantastic time. And on top of that, my Arkansas Razorbacks beat Texas in a mud stomp. Woo, pig, suey. Sorry about that, all of you folks from Texas. Okay, not really. It's been a long time coming. I'm a longtime Razorback fan, and in fact, if you can see right back here there's a little banner that says, "On the eighth day, God created Razorbacks." I'm just through and through a Razorback. So it was extremely, extremely exciting to see my Razorbacks, who have been so beaten down over the last several years, who have had nothing to cheer about, that just has perennially just gotten mud stomped themselves by the better teams that they played in this huge rivalry game, going all the way back to the Southwest Conference and what have you. So Arkansas thoroughly vindicated themselves and did a wonderful job. The atmosphere in Fayetteville, Arkansas, the entire northwest Arkansas region there where we were staying, it was just electric. Everywhere you went, people were talking about the game. So anyway, it was a really good deal. Unfortunately, my wife, bless her heart, was sick almost the entire time, having a flare-up of her diverticulitis. She is still sick today. And bless her heart, she just suffers so much with that. So that kind of put a damper on everything else. You might remember her in your prayers, please, as she continues to struggle with this horrible stuff. Well, it's good to be back with you. Last week, I developed with you the concept of the return of the absent master, found in Matthew chapter 25, 14 and following, in our continuing study of the Olivet Discourse. I shared with you how Daniel chapter 9, 24 to 27 really, in my estimation, just puts a capstone on the whole thing. It becomes the determinative. It becomes the programmatic passage for determining when the Lord's return, the return of the absent master, was to be. And why do I say that? Well, I say that because Daniel was told 70 weeks are determined upon your people and upon your holy city to put away sin, to make the atonement, to finish the transgression, to seal vision and prophecy, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to anoint the most holy. Now, what Daniel was told had to happen within and by the end of the 70 weeks. The making of the atonement, well, let me back up a moment. When he says 70 weeks are determined to put away sin, remember, this has to do with the putting away not only of Israel's sin, but to deal with the problem of sin for all mankind in dealing with and through dealing with Israel's sin. More on that momentarily, because this kind of puts a capstone to everything. But nonetheless, the putting away of sin has to do with the coming of the Lord, as we'll see momentarily. The finishing of the transgression was not finished at the time of the cross. The finishing of transgression, which, by the way, means the filling up of the measure of sin on the part of Israel, and more specifically, the filling up of the measure of sin by killing Jesus's apostles and prophets, Matthew 23, 29 and following. That was not accomplished at the time of the cross. And the bringing in of everlasting righteousness is directly related to the consummation of Israel's festal calendar, as I shared with you in about the last 2 or 3 videos. It had to do with the Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Sukkot, the time in which Israel celebrated the Exodus and looked forward to the coming of salvation, in which she would no longer dwell in tents, even metaphorically, not spiritually. You know, that time of the second Exodus was the time in which Israel were considered strangers and foreigners. They were constantly dwelling in the tents during that 40-year period of time. Well, I want you to note something. Not only during that period of time, but when the 10 northern tribes were sent off into Assyrian captivity, the Lord said, Hosea chapter 9 and verse 7, that in their dispersion, they were what? Strangers and foreigners, living in a foreign land. And what is absolutely remarkable, and by the way, I discussed this in depth in a 20-lesson DVD series on 1 Peter that I have produced. You can purchase it on my website, donkpreston.com, Bible Prophecy. You can order your own DVD set, or you can purchase it for your own download and watch it anytime you wish. But in that 20-lesson DVD series, I point out that Peter was addressing the diaspora, 1 Peter chapter 1, to the elect, those who are scattered abroad. And he uses the very term that was known to refer to the 10 northern tribes in their diaspora situation, in their scattered situation. But he is writing to them about the fact that all of the promises and all of the prophecies of the restoration of Israel, the end of her exile, the end of dwelling in tents, the end of being strangers and foreigners, was coming to an end. And so he writes to them, and by the way, 1 Peter is such an incredibly powerful book to demonstrate that the fulfillment of all of Israel's Old Covenant promises was to be spiritual and not physical. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5, Peter says, you therefore as living stones are being built up a spiritual house to offer up spiritual sacrifices. You're a spiritual priesthood. Okay, they're a spiritual priesthood, offer up spiritual sacrifices in a spiritual temple, in fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises to them. Well, folks, that tells us, number one, the Messianic temple is therefore not a physical temple. Oh, and by the way, specifically to our point here on Sukkot, it tells us that the time of being strangers and foreigners, which, listen to me carefully, 99.9% of all Christianity, they go to 1 Peter and they say, well, you see, Peter's talking to Gentile Christians, but he is describing them now as the true Israel of God. Well, first of all, that's false. He is writing to the elect. He is writing to Christian Jews, but he is writing to those Christian Jews who are nonetheless those who are scattered abroad. They are the diaspora of Hosea 9 and verse 7. And he says to them, I beseech you therefore, brethren, as strangers and foreigners, that you conduct yourselves worthily as you dwell among the Gentiles, just like Israel, the dispersed of the 10 tribes, were dwelling among the pagans. Hosea chapter 8 and verse 8. That's who he is addressing. But now, among those diaspora of the 10 tribes, he is writing to the righteous remnant among that diaspora. And yes, he is reminding them that they're strangers and that they're foreigners, but he tells them, 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 5, that Christ was about to judge the living and the dead. That's a reference, guess what, ladies and gentlemen, to Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Judgment, which is directly associated with Yom Kippur, when the books would be opened at the time of judgment. The books to determine the living, the condemned, and then there was the intermediate. But nonetheless, the atonement would be consummated at the coming of the Lord for salvation. And then that salvation bled right over into Sukkot, but most especially, Shemini Atzeret. The celebration of Rosh Hashanah, the celebration of Yom Kippur, the celebration of Sukkot. Now, dwelling in tents is over. That which Sukkot pointed to. No longer strangers and foreigners. No. Now, on the 8th day, salvation has come. Now, I said I would get to this final aspect of Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 and following that I wanted to, and that is the putting away of sin, to demonstrate that the 70 weeks were not completed at the cross. The 70 weeks were not completed in 34 or 35 AD. I'm already out of time, but I hope you can see that this concept of Sukkot and dwelling in tabernacles, of the booths, looking forward to dwelling in the promised land and celebrating the 8th day. That's addressed right here in 1 Peter. The entire epistle is saturated with references to the coming, the 8th day is not mentioned, but the motif of that celebration, of that coming salvation, permeates this epistle. What an incredible concept. And thus, to continue, Peter could say, 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7, the end of all things has drawn near. And verse 17, the time, literally, the appointed time for the judgment, not a judgment or not simply judgment, but the appointed time, which means hokairos, the divinely appointed time for the judgment has come. Not will come, not is always present, the divinely appointed time for the judgment. What judgment was the divinely appointed time? Well, in Acts chapter 17, 30 and 31, Paul, on the Areopagus, talking to those Greeks about their idolatry, said, the times of this ignorance God has winked at, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, for he has appointed a man by whom he will judge the world in righteousness. Literally is about to judge the world in righteousness, because he says he has appointed a day. Appointed a day. That is the divinely appointed time for the judgment of 1 Peter chapter 4. And that judgment, conflating all three of these final feast days, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, the 8th day, Shemini Atzeret. There is no question whatsoever that Daniel 9 is being played out in Peter, meaning the return of the absent master. The time for that had arrived, meaning the Olivet Discourse and its parable of the return of the absent master cannot be extrapolated off into the future without saying that Israel's last 3 feast days are unfulfilled. The law remains valid, but since that divinely appointed time for the judgment had arrived, that means the return of the absent master. The time for that had arrived, meaning the Olivet Discourse is not divided. And that destroys futurism. Hey, thanks so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. Oh, don't forget, in the morning, I'm going to be discussing the fact that Daniel 9 said 70 weeks are determined to put away sin. You do not want to miss that. So I'll see you on the flip side.